everyone, welcome back to my next video. Xin chào các bạn. Sau đây mình sẽ học thuộc từng đoạn văn ở trong cái bài văn Day of the Dead. Có dịch sang tiếng Việt có nghĩa là ngày của người chết, và mình sẽ học thuộc, mình sẽ đọc từng đoạn một và mình sẽ phản xạ từng đoạn của bài này nhé. Và mình sẽ làm từng cái video nhỏ một chút. Rồi, đầu tiên mình sẽ đọc đúng y chang như trong bài. Và sau đấy mình sẽ chuyển sang thì quá khứ đơn và mình cũng sẽ phản xạ theo thì quá khứ đơn nhé. Phản xạ tức là mình đang áp dụng cái phương pháp theo của thầy AJ Ho, gọi là effortless English, tức là mình hỏi đáp, mình sẽ trả lời hỏi đáp rất là nhanh. Rồi, here we go, bắt đầu nha. Day of the Dead. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I'm curious about this holiday, so I go to the cemetery to see what's happening. What I find is quite interesting. Rồi mình chuyển sang quá khứ nhé. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. What I found is quite interesting. Mình có thể dịch qua một chút nhé. Ngày của người chết, và tôi đến cái Guatemala vào cái ngày của người chết, vào ngày mùng 1 tháng 11. Tôi rất là tò mò về cái ngày lễ này, bởi vậy nên là tôi đã đi đến nghĩa trang để xem cái chuyện gì đang xảy ra, và những cái điều mà tôi nhìn thấy thì khá là thú vị. Rồi bắt đầu mình sẽ phản xạ nhé. Rồi cái câu đầu tiên là I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, let's get started.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, of course. I arrived in Guatemala.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
Me, AJ Ho. AJ, me, of course me. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead.
Well, me, AJ, right? I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I didn't. I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on the November 1st.
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st. Yes, of course. November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala November 1st. On November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Well, Guatemala. Yeah, Guatemala. I arrived Guatemala on November 1st.
Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Was I angry about this holiday?
No, 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 no. I was not angry about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, of course no. I was not sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
Me, AJ. I was curious about this holiday.
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead. Yeah. I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
The holiday. Right? I was
holiday.
curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead. Holiday. I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
Which holiday was I curious about? The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
Of course, the Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, not Christmas.
Well, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
I went to the cemetery. I went to the cemetery.
I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
Of course, the cemetery. I went to the cemetery, not the airport.
Easy. I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
Me, AJ. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Me, right? AJ. I went to the cemetery.
Okay, class. Who would like to do problem 3 on the board? Please don't be me.
Where did I go?
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. I went to the cemetery.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. Right? I went to the cemetery
on the Day of the Dead.
On
November
the Day
1st.
of the Dead. November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
To see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Well, to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
Me, AJ. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala.
Guatemala.
What is the Day of the Dead?
Holiday. The day holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday.
Yes.
When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st. The Day of the Dead are on November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st.
So I went to
the cemetery
to see what was
on the
happening.
Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting.
What I found was quite interesting.
Was it boring?
No, it wasn't. It was not boring. It was interesting.
No, it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, that's right. It was interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting.
Interesting.
How did I feel about the cemetery?
Well, I felt interesting. I felt interesting about the cemetery.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought
It was
it was
interesting.
interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
Of course, it was interesting. It was not boring.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The day of the dead. Guatemala. What I found was quite interesting.
The cemetery.
The
cemetery was interesting.
The cemetery was interesting.
When was the cemetery interesting?
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. The cemetery was interesting on November 1st.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere.
Rồi, mình đã sang hết, mình đã effortless hết đoạn 1 rồi. Thank you for watching. Bye bye. See you next video.